Hi everyone. Cool. So, welcome to Tech Tuesday. My name is Nick, and today I'll be talking about Core Web Vitals. Thanks for joining us. If anyone does have any questions about anything I talk about in the stream, please feel free to leave them in chat. I'll take some time afterwards to look through them and answer what I can. I do have chat open if you do have any questions during the stream, but there is a little bit of a delay, unfortunately, so I might not respond right away, but that's no biggie. Cool. So before starting, I'm going to be assuming that you have a basic knowledge of web fundamentals. So I won't really be diving into the basics of that. I'll also be assuming that you have a little bit of an understanding of SEO, but I will be touching on some of the basics that I'll be talking about today. So in today's talk, I'll be having a look at Google's Core Web Vitals as a whole, and then touching on some of the key areas of largest content paint, or LCP, first input delay, or FID, and cumulative layout shift, or CLS. This one's really going to be acronyms, the stream. So I'll also be looking into why these metrics are seen as important for user experience and why you might be performing poorly and what you could potentially do to fix it. So to start off, what is Core Web Vitals? Core Web Vitals is a set of metrics used by Google as a search engine to quantify a site in terms of user experience to be used as a ranking factor when presenting your site in a user's search. Some of these metrics you may be familiar with if you've dealt with the Lighthouse or PageSpeed reports before. These are also Google products, so they happen to tie into each other quite well. So these Core Web Vitals metrics are used by Google when ranking a site in search results alongside other signals of your site, like how mobile friendly your site is, if your site is served securely, or if your site uses excessive pop-ups, that kind of thing. So these are then used alongside content indicators on your site, which actually look at the content of your site to rank your site versus other sites using the same keywords. So all of these ranking factors together govern how high up in Google search results your site will appear for specific search terms. So, how can you measure your Core Web Vitals? I know I might be jumping the gun here, but I couldn't really figure out where to put this in, so it's going in right at the top. So, there are a few ways that you can measure Core Web Vitals. A good way to measure this is using the Chrome UX report. This is a BigQuery dataset that's published once a month by Google that uses field data, so that's real-world data, to show how your site has been doing with your actual users in the wild. I've included a link down below if you're interested in setting this up for your site. You could also use the Chrome Lighthouse report, which is built into the Chrome web browser. I will be touching on that just now. You can also use the PageSpeed Insights tool. There's a link for this below. It's essentially the same as the Lighthouse report, but run independently of your browser. Then you could also use your site's Google Search Console. So this is where you'll be able to see any issues that you might have. So this is a very good place to start off with when trying to improve your site's ranking in terms of Core Web Vitals. So all in all, the Chrome UX report is going to be your most valuable source of information as it is real-world data for real-world users. In my experience, the scores here are typically a lot more stable and more indicative of your site's performance than the more immediate tools that we have in the Lighthouse reports or PageSpeed Insight reports. That being said, the Chrome Lighthouse report and PageSpeed Insights reports are great for benchmarking any changes that you make. Or if you're actively looking for an issue on your site, they're great tools for helping you diagnose that. But it is worth noting that these conditions, or the conditions under which these reports are generated, are simulated, so the results tend to jump around a little bit. So you might get a score of 40 on one run and then 50 on the next, and it really jumps around quite a bit. Cool, so then moving on. So what's largest content paint? Largest content paint is your largest content paint. So LCP is a metric for measuring a user's experience when they first land on your site. If you've done things right, a user will be able to see something valuable on your site within a very short time of their landing on your site. Get it wrong, and the user might be staring at a collection of weird elements like a navigation bar with no logo for a few seconds until something meaningful loads. In a worst case scenario, a user might think your site is completely broken and move on. This is especially common in single page applications where no placeholder content or loading indicator is shown while the actual rendering framework is loaded. The intent of this metric is to measure how quickly a user might see something on your site. So the target on this one is to have something rendered within 2.5 seconds of the page loading on a reasonable network connection. Of course, we can't control the internet connection that a user might have, but if a user does have a reasonable connection, make sure that they see something in a reasonable amount of time. So the LCP metric differs from another metric you may be familiar with, FCP, or First Content Paint. It differs because LCP cleverly tries to figure out what's the most eye-catching or most relevant piece of information or content on a site above the fold that a user will see when landing on the site. And then it measures how long that takes to become stable, so that the definition of stable will differ from element to element. The elements that are typically considered for LCP can be a piece of text, an image, or a video, or any block level element really. So with a piece of text, it's going to wait until all the fonts have loaded, the right style sheets have been applied, and the text isn't jumping around anymore. If it's an image, it's going to wait until the image is fully rendered. A video is actually quite interesting. It looks for the poster element rather than the video actually starting to play. With other elements, it's more of a play-by-ear situation. So with that in mind, how would you go about finding your largest content paint element? So this is where the Chrome DevTools implementation of the Lighthouse report comes in handy. Run this on your site, filter to the LCP section, and you should be able to identify where you need to optimize. So I'm just going to undo a little mistake here, and then I'm going to show you a quick demo. Okay, great. So I've opened up my DevTools here in Google Chrome, and I've switched to the Lighthouse tab. If you don't see it right away, it's normally hidden away under this overflow menu over here. Cool, so once I've got this open, I'm going to click Generate Report. So this is going to analyze the speed of the site in a simulated environment on a simulated mobile device. It applies some network throttling and some other simulations to the device's infrastructure to see how your site performs. So here, we get a report of everything. So I'm going to focus on the largest contentful paint metric over here, which is LCP, which we've just been talking about. And you can see it's one of the worst metrics. Oh, it's red, so that means bad in this report. This is on purpose. It is kind of easy to optimize for this, but I've deliberately left this as is so I can show you how to identify. So now that I've run this report, I can now filter the results to LCP results and scroll down, and then under the diagnostics section there's this largest contentful paint element, one element found diagnostic here. Clicking this will point out what the largest element is, which is the hero image, which it will be for most sites that happen to have a hero. Okay, great. So now that you've been able to find what your largest content paint metric is, how would you go about improving your score? So a lot of the recommendations you'd get for this are just make your site load faster. So you can do things like make your server respond faster. There's a whole lot of things you can do around serving over HTTP2 or just improving your general server architecture. That's not in the scope of what I'll be talking about tonight, but it is a good place to start if you have that kind of control. You should also be making good use of CDNs, so that's content delivery networks, and then also make use of preloading links for your largest content paint elements or any resource that might affect it, like fonts or style sheets or any rendering frameworks that you're using on your site. Also make sure to minify your resources, that has a big impact, and make sure to compress images and media. So this is especially important if your largest content paint element is a piece of media. Make sure that it's compressed and served efficiently. Cool. So on to first input delay. Ooh. So first input delay measures the interactivity of your site. To provide a good user experience, pages should be responding within 100 milliseconds according to these metrics. This one is definitely a hard metric to work with. So it measures the interactivity of your site. In short, what's measured is the delay between when a user interacts with something on the site and when that interaction is processed. Due to the single-threaded nature of browsers, poor scores in this metric are often due to doing too much on the main thread of the browser. What's measured isn't actually how long an interaction takes to complete, but rather the delay between when the interaction happens and when the event for processing that interaction is kicked off. So that means while you might have some long-running work triggered by an interaction like an API request or some complex animations, as long as your handler kicks in quickly, you should be golden. This is definitely a metric best measured in the field. So making use of the Chrome UX report is going to show you whether or not you have a decent score here or whether you're really struggling. Then referring to the Google Search Console is where you'll get an indication of where you're doing poorly. Again, Lighthouse and PageSpeed Insights do have these metrics available, but it's a bit hit and miss on whether they're picked up in my experience. So, how would you be able to improve on this one? So, like I mentioned, browsers are single-threaded, or JavaScript in a browser typically runs on the main thread. So one way to improve this is or improve your first input delay rather, is to minimize the amount of work that you're doing on the main thread. You can accomplish this by using service workers for heavy operations, or just background workers in general for anything that doesn't need to happen on the main thread. You can also serve smaller JavaScript payloads. This helps by cutting down on the amount of JavaScript parsing the browser needs to do at one time. This is why bundling tools like Webpack will warn if your JavaScript gets too big. And then also put some effort into minimizing the impact of third-party code. This one is especially hard, especially if you work with a marketing team, because everyone wants to have their little analytics tool or their tracking pixel on the site, but that all does build up and it does have an effect on when things get done on your site. So, how can you identify long-running tasks, which is what would happen when your main thread is a bit too busy? So again, you can use the Chrome DevTools for this one, but this time you can make use of the Performance tab. So again, it's probably going to be hidden under this little overflow here, but if you switch to Performance and use this little refresh icon, it'll profile your page after reloading it. You don't need to let it run forever if you're more interested about the performance of your page at the top of the load. And I see I haven't got any this time. Let me try force it again. Okay. Okay. I'm not coming up with any long-running tasks. This one is getting quite close. A long-running task is any task that takes more than 50 milliseconds to complete. So because this is quite a simple site, there's not too much going on. But if there was a lot of JavaScript to parse, like what's going on over here at these evaluate script blocks, these tasks could take a lot longer. So serving your JavaScript externally and not inlining everything could go a long way to helping with that. And also just making sure that if you do have an event handler that does take long, that you try and take out some of what's causing that event handler to take long. Great. So on to the third acronym, CLS, or Cumulative Layout Shift. So Cumulative Layout Shift is all about visual stability. Have you ever been on a news site or just any site in general which has a lot of text that you want to read through, and you're reading an article and then the page jumps and you can't find your place again? That's because of layout shifts. It's not great, and we should really be avoiding this. The Lighthouse report gives us quite a low weight, only 5% of the total page speed score if you were to calculate your total page speed score like we did in the Lighthouse test just now. But personally, I feel this is a very important metric. It's the one that annoys me the most when I'm on a site that gets it wrong. So I really try to prioritize getting this right and making sure elements aren't jumping around. So it is important to note with cumulative layout shift that this metric only looks at unexpected layout shifts. So that means you don't need to be worried about making use of user interaction driven constructs like an accordion or a button that loads some extra content that puts it below where you are now. Because those are user driven, and the interaction or the layout shifts driven by those interaction are considered expected, so they're not going to necessarily count against you. So if you do have poor CLS, it's almost always caused by one of two things. It's either slow asset loading, so if you've got an image or an advert or some piece of content that just takes forever to load, which allows a user to actually scroll to a piece of content that matters, and then it jumps around. Dynamic content is the second worst offender of this as well. Cool. So just in case it's not too clear, I've set up a demo of what this looks like. So if you were on a site and scrolling down a little bit, and you get to this third paragraph, and you're reading it, and suddenly an ad loads in. Now you have to scroll to find where you are again. You scroll to it, and then the second ad loads in, but it's got a completely different size. So they're rotating between the two ads, and this content is just jumping up and down the whole time. That's incredibly annoying. You're not going to carry on reading this article. So one way to fix this is to make sure that you have a fixed height for elements like this, so images that you might be serving, any ads that you might be serving, or any kind of slow loading dynamic content. Just make sure that that space is taken up while that content is loading. For non-image based or in my example ad-based content, like say you have a dynamic section of products that you're loading in the background. A good thing to do is to make use of a skeleton where you create a mock layout with the content that would eventually be there in just the right HTML structure so that you can apply all your CSS to it, and then add like some kind of shimmering loading animation over that. That will ensure that while that content is loading, it's clear to a user that something is going to come there, and your content's not going to jump around once that does eventually load, because you'll just be replacing the skeleton HTML content with some actual content. Cool. So it looks like that's it from me for today. So I hope you have a clearer understanding of what each core Web Vital category is. I did try to go through it in a sort of abstract way, because every web development project has its own quirks, and covering how this would work in a React app versus a very static HTML side versus something heavy or something that runs on an e-commerce platform like Shopify or WooCommerce. It adds a lot of complexity, so I hope that you can take this and apply it to your specific situation. It looks like we don't have any questions at this stage, so I must have either done a terrible or great job, so I'll pick which. And thank you very much for joining Tech Tuesday. Keep an eye out for our next session.